My name is David Bracht, and I'm with Kutak Rock. And as Jim said, that movement, I just rejoined Kutak within the last 3 months after spending a little over 3.5 years with the working for Governor Ricketts, just as Jim does, with the as director of the Nebraska Energy Office. And so today I'm going to actually probably stray a little bit from what the title might have only been, but include a little bit more to maybe recap some perspectives on what my view was over the 3.5 years there, and maybe reaching even a little bit further back, looking into my background. As Jim said, I've spent my entire career in one point or another, or one way or another, in really rural development. Started out in the banking industry, worked with an organization that had banks throughout Nebraska and Iowa, some in South Dakota, which fit well for me because I grew up on a farm here in northeast Nebraska. And towards the end of about a 10-year time in the banking industry, I was working with a farm credit regulator in Washington, D.C., and went to law school at night. And at that point, I was really focused on environmental law. And what drove me to that, because I'm an Aggie at heart, is that I could see what was happening both to agriculture in general, I think in our rural communities, how environmental issues were of growing importance. And so that really prompted me to do that. And fast forward then, after a couple of cycles, both in the banking industry and law, into government and back out again, what I can say is certainly here in Nebraska, the health of our rural communities, the economic health, and I think our environmental health are very much tied. And that's true for our rural agribusinesses, it's true for our communities, it's true really for the economic health of the state. So that's what I'm going to try and talk a little bit about this evening. John's back here, so I'm not going to miss my Nebraska nice rules. Please be nice. Renewable energy in Nebraska. What is that really, and why is it important? Well, there's a couple of things, and again, this is going to be where I'm going to stray just a bit based on the 3.5 years that I spent with the Nebraska Energy Office. Something that a lot of people don't don't really think about it. Because I'd go around and I'd be talking, and I'd say, we're an energy state. And people would look at me and say, no, in different times we might have said, first, we're a Cornhusker state, but now at least we'll talk about being a corn state or a beef state, but we really didn't think about being an energy state. But the reality is we were always shipping energy, and we have been. We were just used to harvesting it out of a field like that and shipping it out for decades and decades and decades in open hopper cars on an export basis. A lot of our corn was always exported. More recently in the ethanol industry, and that's really where that was that first intersection of energy and agriculture to me. And that's really what I consider energy Nebraska style, at least the beginnings of it. But if you go back to the Native Americans that were here 200 and 300 years ago, they were really doing the same thing. They were just carrying that energy, storing that energy, collecting that energy, using different vehicles. We're using the prairie to harvest that sun energy and buffalo meat to store it. So fast forwarding to now, what does that really mean? And the one I like to talk about, because I know a lot about it, I spent 10 or 15 years really focused on ethanol, and it's a success story that I think we can repeat in Nebraska. Most of you probably know, and I'm not going to belabor it, but Nebraska is the #2 ethanol producer in the country. Along with Iowa, we produce 40% of all the ethanol in the country here between our two states. And it has been a dramatic rural economic development driver in Nebraska. And I'm going to drill down just slightly on one to give you an example, because I'm going to refer to it later. I have a client who, I always screw up if I try the laser thing, so I'm not going to do, oh, there it is. I think maybe I will. Way over there in Madrid, Nebraska, 350 people. That project, and it's not a particularly large ethanol plant. Today it's about a 60 million gallon plant. It started out at a 50 million gallon plant. It was about a $100 million project. When we were building those projects, and again I'm going to tie this back to wind here pretty soon, I am quite sure that in Furnace County the only thing that would have been that large from an overall investment had been perhaps the hospital. That would probably be the only thing, or if you took in aggregate all of the expenditures in the high school. So you had a $100 million investment go into a 300 people community that today that plant employs 35 people, roughly an average salary of over $60,000 a year. That had a dramatic economic impact, not to speak of the drive on the corn industry and the other things, but the property tax. And so we've seen that happen about 25 times across Nebraska. That was really our first level of Nebraska energy style. Our ethanol, as I pointed out, was really just using one of our natural resources, much like our agribusiness has always been. One of our other great natural resources that all of you here already know is we are in the wind corridor. And in fact, as you know, I've got fourth highest. You'll see some different things back and forth, between third and fourth highest of total wind potential of all the states in the country. We've been a little bit slower to develop that, but I think we have some opportunities to make lemonade out of those lemons, because as that development is happening now, we are getting to take advantage of, and if you were upstairs here just recently, you heard one of the speakers say that when he was first working on projects, they were talking about $60 per megawatt cost of wind. Kind of a corollary to that, in the early wind projects that I worked on, we were talking about 30% capacity factors, and maybe, in fact, just barely 30% capacity factors. In 2016 and 2017 in Nebraska, we actually were one of the top two states both years, top 1 year and second last year to New Mexico, with the highest capacity factor average of all the projects in the state at 45%. And I'm aware of several projects that really are a lot well into the 50% capacity factor, and in fact approaching 60% capacity factor. That's a result of improving technologies. Some of it's just a result of getting the turbines bigger and higher, capturing the wind better that way. But that has dramatically changed those costs. And if you were listening yesterday, or earlier this morning, one of the speakers said, while we started at 60 and over per megawatt for cost of wind, we're looking at sub-20s now. And even if you take out the PTC, which is winding out now, I'm pretty confident that we're going to see regularly in that 30 megawatt cost of wind on an unsubsidized basis. So it has gone from being, because of technological improvements, very, very competitive cost of energy, and again, making lemonade out of our lemons because we were slower in that development. We are getting the benefit of that. And what do I mean by that? And certainly there's been, Nebraska has been a little bit different in its wind development. And I get to play a role in that, both in my private legal practice earlier on and certainly in the last 3.5 years at the Nebraska Energy Office, because we are a different state, in part through our public power structure. And a lot of times folks will take that as me saying, well, public power didn't know how to use wind, or there's something there. I think the thing we have to remember in a lot of those cases, and then compare it to our states, neighboring states, our utilities are focused on their individual communities. And what we've seen in some other states that have been more rapid in their development of their wind is they could really take a countrywide look at it. So if a utility in Iowa is developing their wind, they can look at it both as a sales opportunity to meet their service load in Iowa and also sell it outside of the state. So our structure and our legal statutes weren't quite set up. I'm not going to go through the details here, but what the intent here is to show that if you go back to 2010 and a couple of those before, we've seen a steady rise as we've taken our statutory and our regulatory structure as it relates to utilities and made it work so that our current national structure of how wind projects, how the commercial private sector has developed wind projects could work with that. And the most recent of those was after Jim and I were working for Governor Ricketts, which would be in 2015, LB 824, April 2016, I guess, excuse me. And we've seen continued growth since then. So the point of this slide is to say this has been something that's been building for a significant amount of time, both aligning how we look at energy in the state and taking advantage of those resources. And I think we are having a great opportunity because we've been slow and methodical in that. I can tell you, looking at some other states, and I won't pick on them, but they probably got into incentivizing their wind with state funds, and Nebraska's never really done that. And that puts us in a stable playing field, and I can tell you, talking to wind developers, both in my role at the Energy Office and now after as clients, is they appreciate that stability, because instability can really come back and bite you. And in a couple states, again, I won't mention them, but we used to really hate them in football, that's been a real challenge. And I think that is an opportunity. It shows what we're doing well in Nebraska, how we've been paced and measured and thoughtful how we've developed that. So where does that leave us today? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some that are going up right now. But as that shows, and as Jim said, the Nebraska Energy Office has a good website with a lot of information. I used to call it, and I'm looking forward to Jim being able to have some of his team help the Energy Office. I used to call it, we were kind of at Internet 0.5. So there's a lot of data there that we had to swim through quite a little bit. But this is a slide that's on there, on our wind statistics page, on the Energy Office wind statistics page. And what it shows is where we're at today, the wind projects that are operating today. And as the notes there note, and I think that captures everybody that has started, but we're at 1,452 megawatts today, and that's not quite, but almost double what we were at when Jim and I started working for the governor in 2015, so we've had some pretty significant development from there. What is that? In addition to that, we have about 862 megawatts that are under construction today. That's according to WEA. And I think that under construction can have a variety of different meanings. Some of them are pretty early construction, but these are projects that there's activity going on and in all likelihood are going to be built, almost certainly going to be built. And in advanced development, another 566 megawatts. So you're seeing that continued growth. And even if we look at just where we're at today, we're looking at about $2.6 billion of investment that have gone into the state of Nebraska today. And thinking about how that happens, on almost all of that is outside money that's come into the state and can have, much like those ethanol plants did, have a pretty significant impact from a tax standpoint. I can name 3 counties right now that I've run the numbers on that 10% of their property tax is paid by the wind farms that are in that state, or in that county, excuse me. And so one of them is under construction now, so that'll be starting probably next year. And that was one of the things that I think, just to give a tip of the hat to the legislature again as well, because one of the challenges, and I had ethanol clients where those communities suffered through this as well, is that in that kind of ethanol investment, that $100 million investment, it got depreciated pretty quickly, some portions of it at least. The legislature, I think very smartly, we have a nameplate capacity tax here in Nebraska, and that helps those local communities manage that tax base because it keeps it essentially on a level basis for 20 years. And so again, I think the wind development here in the state and how we've seen that development has been very positive in, again, that measured pace that it's using to help the development of the economy in our state. I'm going to go through a few more slides, and then I'm going to talk about, without on a map, I'm always a little uncomfortable putting on a map until the plant project is operating for a whole variety of reasons. But I want to go a step further as to looking forward, what's going to drive that, what's driving that's in construction right now, what's driving and going to drive those additional purchases going forward. And I think we've got really good examples of both of these in Nebraska right now. The single biggest thing that is driving wind purchases today, and those of you that are directly involved in the industry, you know this. Some of you that are maybe spend most of your time in Nebraska may not be quite as familiar, but we have a great example, is the corporate renewables purchases. That has really become the focus. And as the production tax credit essentially starts to scale down, as it is at the end of 2020, what we're seeing is those companies that can essentially monetize the benefit of that green energy are really able to take advantage of that, are really stepping into that. And certainly in this transition, they're already doing that, and I would anticipate that they will continue to do that. A great example that we have here is the Facebook project that's a data center being built in Papillion, Nebraska. And I say that's a great example because I think it shows really the tie between the economic development that can go on and needs, and certainly for benefit our state is good to go on in Omaha, and how that relates, and in fact how that was enabled by our superior renewable energy resources. So Facebook, in its process of deciding where they're going to build data centers, are driven by the availability of renewable energy. In this case, it's the Rattlesnake Creek project, which is a 320 megawatt project. The developer is Trade Wind Energy, and Facebook has already committed to 200 megawatts of that 320. Trade Wind has, through its partner Enel, I think has already probably got commitments on all the rest of that, and that project is under construction right now. So if you take together that Facebook project, which has been expanded twice, I think, since it was originally announced, plus the wind project, that's over $1 billion investment in the state just in that project. So again, think about that. What kind of industries have we seen that type of investment, that $1 billion investment? So I think that's really a critical part as to when we look at that. What really made that possible, I don't see anybody from OPPD in right now, but yeah, there we go, sorry, right up front, was the fact that OPPD worked with Facebook and ultimately came out with a green tariff that is available to any customer that meets those same kind of requirements, but it really allowed Facebook to meet its corporate goals. And that's what really drove that project happening. I'm going to talk about one other ethanol. I don't have a really nice slide on it. It's a little bit of a small project, but shame on me for not having a nice slide. And it ties two of my passions together then, ethanol and wind. On the other end of the scale, while the Rattlesnake Creek project is, I think it's 110, if I'm not mistaken, turbines about there. The ethanol plant near Fairmont, Nebraska, working with Perennial Public Power District, the local public power district, and a Nebraska-based developer, put in 3 turbines, 6.9 megawatts, that are going to allow that ethanol plant to lower its carbon intensity score and be able to sell its ethanol, continue to sell its ethanol into the California market. So a really significant issue for our Nebraska ethanol industry is most of our ethanol goes to the West Coast. And California has had for, I think, coming up on 10 years now, a law that essentially is setting a downward slope to the carbon intensity that can go into, that ethanol has to have to be able to be shipped into California. And so all of our ethanol operators are looking at ways to reduce their carbon intensity. And in that particular case, wind, those 3 wind turbines That ethanol plant was able to take the energy, or the fact that they were getting energy from those, to the California Air Resources Board and get an approval that they have a lower carbon intensity score. So that, what wind is offering then, and I also think in addition to the corporate purchases, we would kind of within the industry call that a commercial and industrial project. That's going to be the other area that I think is a really significant opportunity and something that really fits into the Nebraska style, because I think that we're going to have parts of Nebraska that maybe aren't as interested in having 100 turbines or a really large wind project, notwithstanding the, the significant investment that can be. But a 2 or 3 or 4 wind turbine project might fit really well within that community. I'm going to move on then to what has been a newer development and was really an exciting development and thing for me to get involved in as I was at the Energy Office. So when I started, when Jim and I started, and when I started the Energy Office, if you would have asked me and said, well, what about solar? Well, I would have said a variety of things, and part of it was cost-driven, because ethanol, like wind, has had really, really impressive improvements because of technology gains, that more productive and less cost. But frankly, I still would have said, yeah, I'm not sure. Hard to say. Now, Nebraska actually has a pretty good resource, solar resource. The information I've seen will be somewhere in the 13, 14, 15 level because we have a large area. Particularly the western part of our state has its altitude makes a difference in solar, and so there's some opportunities there. But when I started at the Energy Office, we had probably a grand total within the state of 1 megawatt of solar. Now, again, thinking back just for relation here, I talked about the turbines that were going in, and if you picked up, certainly on a current project, it might be a 2.5 megawatt turbine per one turbine. So in 2015, all of our solar across, most of which was rooftop with a couple of small I'd call them commercial installations, all together were less than the power that would have been produced by one wind turbine. So we have to keep in mind some of the scale, but we've seen some dramatic growth because of that. It started with people trying some different things, and I'd again give my tip of the hat to MPPD in this particular case. This is a picture of a project that was done up by Lindsay, Nebraska. And it was a project with the local public power district there. I think it's Cornhusker Public Power District. I don't have that and don't have my notes in front of me, but worked with Lindsay Manufacturing, the irrigation pivot equipment company, and a farmer up there. And that array, solar array of 25 megawatts that was installed, I believe, in 2012, basically collects enough power, roughly, during the course of the year and operating under the state's net metering statute, that they have sufficient electricity that then they can operate their pivot during the season that they are irrigating. So that was really at a kind of a beginning stage. Where are we at today, though? We have seen some dramatic growth in that time. So it went from 1 megawatt to probably roughly somewhere between 25 and 30 megawatts. Jim mentioned earlier this morning about this solar map, which is a really great map, and he gets all the credit for it because we didn't do it when I was there. But it reflects what we did, and I will give a credit to the Energy Office there. In those, so this would have been in the 2015-2016 time frame. Solar was still kind of getting its legs here, some of the costs. So through our Dollar and Energy Savings Loan Program, and if Rick is in here, Custer County Public Power District, we worked on several projects with our Dollar and Energy Savings Loan Program to help support those solar installations on some ranchers and farmers that are in the Custer County area that are now supplying power to Custer County Public Power District. And we've seen that same concept all over the state now. I think our largest solar array right now, someone's going to correct me if I get it wrong, I think it's probably just under 6 megawatts. So we're still pretty small scale if you look at other states and what they're doing. But I know that there are developers and communities and businesses that are looking at bigger opportunities. And so solar becomes another way. It's a different way. Each one of these things have different challenges. The thing about a wind turbine is that you really have the capability of, it takes a relatively small amount of land out of production, and so it's really an additive resource use. Solar becomes a substitute resource use. If I've got a solar array there, I'm really not going to be able to farm under it. I might need to run some goats under it to keep the weeds down, but that's going to be about the size of that. But it really has some opportunities, and in fact, I don't have the slide in here, but a presentation that was given 2 years ago at this conference included a study that showed that the Lawrence Berkeley Lab put together that showed what the production profile would be of a 200 megawatt wind farm and a 120 megawatt solar farm in Elgin, Nebraska. And on a day-around, season-around basis, it really produced a pretty level kind of capacity factor. So I see some continuing growth and interest in that as we go. I want to leave enough time to talk about two things. This is a little bit of a brag point. Fremont, Nebraska, which has, under our public power system, has a municipal power company up there. Brian Newton is the administrator there, and they put together a solar project that really had some unique characteristics to it, a community solar project that actually had quite a little bit of play all around the country. I had energy directors that I was working with in our national organization sending me from all over the country that they had noticed, and there's a study, if you go to the Smart Electric Power Alliance, they have a 10 or 15 page document that talks about how that was put together. Sold out 1.5 megawatts, I think, in about 7 weeks. And a customer or a citizen or a business there in Fremont could either buy a panel or buy a share. And that was part of what I think made that work so well. Another thing, a project that's under development that I got to work some with the developer as I was at the energy office, and also now working with him in private practice, is a biomass. And something that, and I'll be honest with you, at first mentioned to me, I thought, okay, do we really have enough wood here in Nebraska? But this developer has really done his homework, and he's got the arrangements. So he has a power purchase agreement. This is a project that's under development. They're kind of in fundraising and hope to get to construction phase pretty soon. But they're going to produce two things. One is going to be electricity for the city of South Sioux City, and then the second thing is going to be torrefied wood pellets, which is essentially a drop-in substitute for coal. Those wood pellets, those torrefied wood pellets, will have roughly the same BTU content as the coal that would be used in some of our plants here in Nebraska. Now, it won't work in every plant, but I think it has some really exciting opportunities. Opportunities looking forward, I think, if you really get out on the horizon, we're a livestock state, so we have a lot of opportunities, I think, in biogas. We already use landfill gas in a number of facilities, I think 10 across the state, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for that. Before I go to questions, I might just go through and talk about just a couple of projects that are either under construction, because I think that's part of what you might have been thinking about. I'd already mentioned the Rattlesnake Creek project, which is, as I said, 320 megawatts, and looking at my notes now here, it is 101 turbines. Also up in that area, already ground broken, and a project that has a PPA with Omaha Public Power District is the Shoals Wind Project that NextEra is building. And that's 160 megawatts in Wayne County, a 71 turbine project. Also, the upstream project in Antelope County, and if it's Antelope County, we know it's Invenergy, because that's where they had 3 of their projects. That's folks that I've worked with for years. But so that's an additional project that'll be there, over 200 additional megawatts in that county that I believe is either already under construction or will be here pretty soon. And then there's a couple of other projects that are approaching that very much. And I just thought of my note here, I want to talk about one other thing. In southeast Nebraska, there's a couple of projects in Saline and Nuckolls County. Those are really in the development stage, where I know one has most or all of its landowner contracts in place, but an important stage with that is once that wind developer knows he has that wind contract, or that he has the capability of producing that, is going out and finding the buyer for that wind. And this is a complex market because of where the PTCs are at and some things like that, but I know that there's a lot of activity there in Saline and Nuckolls County. And then in central Nebraska, literally news just last week, Sempra received zoning approval for their Prairie Hills wind project, which is going to be 110 turbines. I think that probably puts it in the neighborhood of 220 or 250 megawatts. I didn't have the precise on that. So we're continuing to see that development. So those are projects would be those ones that are either under construction or under heavy development right now. And I think that it is likely we're going to continue to see that. After 2020, when the PTC is really in a different marketplace, that's when we're going to see where those corporate renewable purchases become more of the importance, and also that commercial and industrial. So with that, I think we have at least a couple minutes for some questions, if anybody has any questions. Can I ask a show of hands? How many people live in greater Nebraska, outside of Lincoln or Omaha, that are here at the conference and in Nebraska? How many of you have an ethanol plant in your community? So I see actually quite a few. How many have a wind project today in your community? Not quite so many, but again, kind of spread out. And so that would be my closing point. As I said, I've spent 30 years working on really rural development in Nebraska. If I had my druthers and were better able to convince my wife, I think I would live out in western Nebraska. I grew up on a farm. We were in a cattle feeding operation. I think I would really enjoy that. But what I know in spending those 30 years is the most important part of that is how do we continue to maintain the economy that we have in greater Nebraska. And I really think that renewable energy, ethanol, we've already done it, our wind and solar resources is another great opportunity for that. And the fantastic thing about the wind projects, and kind of I find it an inspirational story, is I told you that I had worked with the Invenergy folks for quite some time, but just a microcosm in that community of Neely, Nebraska. So the Prairie Breeze projects were 200 megawatts. It's about 310 megawatts altogether now. So Invenergy has a service center in Neely, Nebraska. I think Neely is probably about 850 people, so a fairly small community. That service center today now, I think they have 15 or 16 people in that group. And in talking to those people, many, in fact, I would say most of, you got to be both younger and in better shape than I am to climb up and down those turbine towers, are younger folks that grew up in that area. And in fact, the office manager and her husband is I think he's the technician manager for that office. And they told me that they really couldn't live in Neely and be able to support the lifestyle. They had a really small farm. Farming's, as we all know, is really economically challenging unless you've got the resources to be there. And these projects have allowed their family to be back in Neely where they really wanted to be and have a very good lifestyle, really good wages. And that's inspiring to me, because I think it's so important for us to think about in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, what's going to support our communities. And I think this is really something that can do that in a very good way. So with that, if there aren't any other questions, or John, if you have a thought.
The population of Neely is 1,527.
Oh,
I just thought now would be a good time to bring that up. Thank you, Google. And as the president of a farm organization, we struggle to diversify our economic revenue streams. And so for us, as you look at ethanol and wind, these are two natural resources that we already own, that we already control, And so if we can take corn, the sorghum, and some of those commodities and put value added to them, and keep the economic activity for doing that in our rural communities, then you can not only create new farm income, but you can create new jobs and good paying jobs and good new tax base. And so if you look at the things that we have done in our state to try to encourage rural economic development, all the strategies that we've pursued, and all the smokestacks that we've tried to chase, and all the different kinds of iterations of business incentive programs, two of the most successful rural economic development programs that we have done in our state, and they'd both be certainly in the top 4 or 5, would be ethanol development and wind development. And so, all of this additional capital investment and all of these good paying jobs and all of this additional farm income is being spread out in rural communities who need help the most. And I thought one of the most apt descriptions that I've heard came from my stepson west of Wayne, who's 42 years old, farming dry land, and his banker told him, you're going to have to go to town and get a job in order for us to continue to work with you with your farm operating loan this year. And so he did. But he explains that the additional wind turbines that he's getting are part-time jobs. And he said, every wind turbine I get is a part-time job that I need to be able to stay in the farming business and be able to meet my obligations. And so, as you look at where we're at, the 732 additional megawatts of wind that are in process now, it's going to be critical that we see those as a finish line in the next 3 years. So thank you for your presentation.
Let's give David a round of applause. Thank you.